Started. We have a pretty packed schedule today, so we're going to try and be as efficient as possible. So welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you here today. My name is Kayla Wansnyder. I'm the East River Resilience, East River Community Resilience Coordinator. So thank you so much for being here for our third annual Winter Forum. We have some really amazing content and some great speakers for you today. And we hope you learn something new, make some new connections, and hopefully you'll be able to use some of this information in your work. So where some of the goals for today are to set the tone and gain momentum and commitment for this next year, as well as inspire action. And we want you to hear about some of this really great work that's going on in the watershed, and what resilience projects that we're working on too. So just to kick it off, for those who are not as familiar with the East River Collaborative, we are a regional partnership working to build flood resilience in the watershed. And we do this through community engagement, outreach, and collaboration. And we're really focusing on a few different areas. And so one of those is cross-boundary collaboration, really breaking down those barriers between municipalities and siloing in government, building community capacity, doing some knowledge exchange, exploring and having technical expertise, making sure that all of this information that we're gathering is really data informed for sustainable growth and development, and really trying to encourage nature-based solutions in these planning processes, as well as including socially vulnerable populations. So the East River Collaborative started in early 2022, early 2020. This was kind of started based on this really massive flood event in 2019, where over 45 homes had to be condemned. Hundreds of people had to be rescued from the banks of the river. And so a number of organizations kind of rallied together around this cause. On the screen here, you see the core team. So the East River Collaborative is really coordinated by the Nature Conservancy, the Wisconsin Sea Grant, and New Water. So, and we also couldn't have done as much as we're doing today without our funders. So Fund for Lake Michigan and Wisconsin Coastal Management. So then you can go to the next slide, Joy, please. I want to start off with the agenda. There should be a link in chat to the participant packet. It has your agenda in there. It has speaker information and some of the other information that we'll be going through today. So we're going to start off after this with a short poll. We're going to go over some watershed updates, hearing from partners, talk about this East River framework that we've been working on for a number of years. Then we'll go on to Lightning Funder Forum, a short break, and then dive into some watershed initiatives presentations. And then lastly, we'll hear about the Iowa watershed approach from Larry Weber. And so then lastly, I'd just like to remind you of some Zoom courtesy items. Everyone should be on mute right now, but feel free to turn your video on. We'll have some opportunities later in the meeting to be able to ask questions. So if you do want to come off mute to ask your question, you're welcome to do that. And then lastly, as you saw on your prompt on the screen, this meeting is being recorded, and we'll be posting it on our website later on. So with that, I will pass the mic to Adam Beckley, who will be starting us off with the poll.
Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, so today we're going to start off by using a tool called Poll Everywhere. And so could I have the screen share? Yeah. So we're going to start off with a poll about what organization do you represent today, and then get into sort of where we're at with what we think about for resilience. So the poll is available in our chat. So if you click on that link, you can go to our Poll Everywhere tool and click that link, and you'll be able to enter. First question is, what organization do you represent today? And then Joy, would you mind letting me share screen so I can show our results? And can you enable screen sharing for me, please?
Adam, I think you might have to activate the question in Poll Everywhere too.
Oh, I activated it before we started, but there we go.
There we
Sorry
go.
about that. Okay, so now as we see the responses coming in, we can see kind of who is in the room today. So National Weather Service, DNR, Sea Grant, Army Corps of Engineers, City of Green Bay, Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance, DNR, New Water. So a couple folks from DNR here, a couple folks from City of Green Bay. And if you are having issues getting into the Poll Everywhere, again, the link's in the chat. If you've got a question, put it in the chat. So Fish and Wildlife Service, Nature Conservancy, Brown County Planning and Land Services, Brown County Zoning. So we've got good representation from Brown County. Let's, I think we've got a good idea of who's here today. Let's move to our next question, which I will open up to our next question, which is, what are your favorite flood solutions for the East River? So this question is going to show up a little differently. It's going to show up as a word cloud, where the most frequent responses show up larger. There's a couple of hints for using the word cloud. If you have more than one word in your answer, use a tilde or an underscore. That'll link the words together so they show together in the word cloud. For example, elevate tilde homes. That'll show up as one phrase rather than two separate words. Feel free to enter more than one response, and you can enter words you already see in the word cloud. So I will go over to our Poll Everywhere, and feel free to start entering your words, and we'll see them pop up in real time in the word cloud. And you use the same link. So first response is wetlands. Wetland restorations, got multiple answers already. And we'll make this word cloud available following the meeting to kind of give an idea of what folks are saying. So we've got a lot of responses for wetlands, water storage, wetland restoration. Those are getting larger. So if you agree with that, feel free to type those words in as well. Green infrastructure is growing. Floodplain zoning's getting bigger. So we've got a lot of favorite flood solutions in the watershed. So appreciate everyone sharing their input. We'll give it a couple more seconds. So enter your last favorite response, and then we'll kind of take a look at it. So things that are popping out to me: wetlands, green infrastructure, water storage, floodplain zoning, nature-based solutions. So thanks everyone for sharing. I will save that word cloud. We'll send it out afterwards. And so now we've got a little bit of idea of who's here and what we think of flood resilience. So thanks for participating. We'll do another poll a little bit later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. That was really fun to see. We're going to jump right into our watershed updates. So we're going to be talking about hearing some speakers doing some projects and policy across the watershed. So just as a reminder, please put your questions in chat. Speakers will be able to answer them afterwards. Or we'll be able to connect you with them later as well. So we're going to start off with Kari Hagnow. She is the Northeast Wisconsin Land Steward at the Nature Conservancy, and she's going to be talking about pollinator plantings and native planting projects within the watershed. So Kari, you can take it away.
Thank you, Kayla, and hopefully everyone can hear me. So as Kayla said, I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and what I want to do today is just give folks who are on the call a sense of a few projects we've initiated with some partners in the watershed, specifically some native pollinator plantings that are happening at sites adjacent to the East River. And we have 3 sites or 3 places we're working with right now. So that's the town of Ledgeview, the city of Green Bay, and the village of Alloway. And the picture that you're seeing there is an example of one of our sites in the town of Ledgeview. Those who are familiar with Ledgeview Park might recognize the parking lot and the East River on the right side of the photograph there. And this planting is about 0.4 acres, so just under a half acre size. Really meant to kind of slow the flow of water coming off those impervious surfaces like the parking lot and filter that water as it goes into the river. So as I said, there's 3 municipalities that we're working with. There's a total of actually 5 planting sites. So this is one in Ledgeview. There's a second one in Ledgeview. We have 2 sites that we're working with in the town or the village of Alloway, and then there's a 0.7 acre site in the city of Green Bay that's part of a larger project as well. And I definitely want to take a moment to recognize that the funding for these projects is coming from the Fund for Lake Michigan, who's also funding part of our overall East River Collaborative initiative here. So if we want to go to the next slide quickly. And, I know I only have a few minutes for this, so I'm keeping it really short and simple, but I wanted to touch on why these plantings are important and part of our strategy for not only reducing flooding in the East River, but also improving habitat and some other things within the East River watershed. So, when we think about native plants versus what was at some of these sites, which was turf grass, or I should say is turf grass, because we haven't installed the plantings yet. That's on the docket for this coming year. But when we think about native plants versus those turf grass or other invasives or other plants like that, the native plants really provide deep roots that are able to take up more water. They hold the soil in place. So in these areas along the East River where we see erosion of the stream bank, these can help. And they, like I said, they can filter that water, so removing nutrients and pollutants before they get to the East River. And really, as an ecologist, one of the things that I really like is that this diverse plant community, it really provides habitat and food for a variety of pollinators that includes birds and butterflies, as well as other wildlife along the river. And then overall, I would say native plantings can improve aesthetic quality. The picture that I have here, some of you may be familiar with, this is actually the banks of the Fox River, but it's a planting that's done by the master gardeners right along the Fox River near, you can see the De Pere Dam there in the background and the Lock Tender's old house. And to me, they've planted just a gorgeous pollinator planting here that does all of these things, but has plants blooming throughout the year. So really provides, I shouldn't say throughout the year, throughout the growing season, but really provides this beautiful garden as you're walking right along this public path. So that is I will add, again, these plantings are going to go in the coming year. We haven't installed them yet, but we're looking forward to working with those partners when the growing season rolls around to get those in. So I will take any questions with maybe the 30 seconds I have left.
Excuse me, I'd like to ask a quick question. Are you using these pollination areas as a way to seed the area with more and more pollinators? The reason I'm asking this is I'm installing mass plantings along the East River on my property that are perpendicular to the stream. So my intention is to use the wildflowers that I've selected to basically pollinate downstream. Has there been any thought put into using these as a pollination regeneration station, is the term that I'm using for it, where the seeds flow downstream and repollinate? I see that's the way the invasives have spread, and I just look at using those plants for that. I think that's a good way to do it. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for that question. And I will say we haven't thought about that at this stage of the game, but we are hoping to, use these as kind of demonstrations to get others interested in native pollinator plantings. And I think as we continue planning within the East River Watershed, I really like that idea and thinking bigger like that, and appreciate the comment. And what did you call them again?
Pollination regeneration station.
Pollination regeneration station.
So what I'm doing is I'm actually taking the plants that have done exceptionally well, the Joe Pye weed and the Rebecca and the purple cone flowers, and I'm planting those like I said, perpendicular to the stream. So I know that the seeds are going to be flowing downstream, and regenerating downstream. So I would love to see those in all the swales where we could have generation stations on the river. That's just preparing.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions. We really need to be moving on. Any other questions that you want answers to, please put them in chat. I know there are probably a lot of them out there for you. So we will be moving on to Nicole Van Helden. She is the Director of Land Conservation at the Nature Conservancy, and she's going to be speaking about Streambank stabilization and some of the East River Collaborative's efforts on this. Take it away, Nicole.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here this morning. If you live in the watershed, this is probably a familiar kind of picture if you've been down to the banks of the East River or the tributaries to the East River. And we had some field trips this summer with the collaborative to talk more in depth about this issue, but the challenge of flooding also brings eroding stream banks. And when the water moves quickly and is, doesn't have anywhere else to go, but, scouring the banks of the river, we get lots of tree and other debris, and then all of that soil eroding. And so that is the problem. And there are lots of things we can do in the watershed to try to soak in the water before it gets into the river. But then we've got these issues in the actual stream itself. And how do we try to remedy that as well? So next slide. So in our watershed, we have plans that either Outagamie or Brown County has developed. They're called the 9 key element plans, and that's kind of a wonky term from the EPA. But the DNR and EPA have approved all but one sub-watershed plan in the East River Watershed, and the last one is coming soon. It's in review status. But these plans, either the staff have walked and surveyed the river and the stream banks, or have modeled where there is erosion of stream banks. And as you can see from this map here, they rank that, there's slight erosion to the red, which is very severe. So this is just a snapshot of an area in the town of Ledgeview, and in that lower right corner, or lower left, sorry, corner, is a location of a project that we're going to be looking at doing a stream bank restoration design for. And so how can we use these tools where they've prioritized and identified where stream bank problems are. So in the chat, we'll put a link to those plans. The plans are definitely a little wonky, and if you're not used to looking at 9 key element plans, you can just look at the sub-watershed that you're interested in, and every one of the plans has a stream bank erosion section. So you'll have to scan through the plan, but maps like this are in there for all of the sub-watersheds. So we're utilizing that information, and then the next slide. Then we need the resources to get the work done. And so thanks again to Fund for Lake Michigan for providing the financial support. We are working with 2 landowner partners, 2 municipal partners. Well, two partners, Town of Ledgeview and the Baird Creek Preservation Foundation, which works in cooperation with the City of Green Bay. And we are going to be working this calendar year on designs to restore 2 sections of severely eroding stream bank, one near Ledgeview Park and the other right along the trail at in Baird Creek. So those sites are coming. And next slide, I think. Yeah. So this is what we hope to see in the future, and it won't look exactly like this, but this is a great opportunity to utilize nature-based solutions and thinking about engineering and how that works together. These stream banks, we can't restore them back to exactly the way they were before. Streams naturally move, but you can use techniques called bioengineering, where you utilize things like these sticks and root wads and things like that, correctly placed stones and things like that, to have a more natural stream bank, and to also have the river and the stream bank in a more gentle slope, so that when that water rises, it can come up into the floodplain instead of just scouring the sides of the stream bank. So we are excited to get those designs ready, so then we'll be able to apply for some funding to help those projects get installed. And then the other thing, there's a quick read in the chat, a link to some work that colleagues of ours in Missouri did. It's just a really quick summary of the issues with stream banks. We are not unique in the East River, but why stream bank erosion happens, and these bioengineering solutions that are possible. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Nicole. That was really wonderful. Our next speaker is Matt Heyroth. He is the zoning administrator at Brown County Planning and Land Services, and he will be talking about the floodplain policy updates.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, as stated, I'm Matt Heyroth, zoning administrator for Brown County. I don't have any slides or anything, but I can just give you some significant dates or timelines. And I know that there's others on the Zoom call today that also have knowledge of this process for updating the FEMA floodplain maps. The county received the letter of final determination on November 10th, which at that point, the communities have 6 months to officially incorporate and update their floodplain ordinance. So that gives the county to up to May 9th of this year. It's my understanding that, for example, City of Green Bay, Village of Bellevue, Village of Alloway, I think Village of Howard, most communities that are adjacent to the Bay of Green Bay are being required to update based on a recent Great Lakes coastal flood study, where the FEMA contractor analyzed and basically, are providing us with the latest and greatest base flood elevations. From what I can tell from my review, It's going to be lowering vertically the base flood elevations, and it's also lessening the amount of floodplain that comes onto the shore. Along with that, the county is being required to remove our basement exemption. And so those that are not familiar with what that means is basically back from the late 60s when the communities were required to adopt and enter into the National Flood Insurance Program. The communities had received an allowance for residential structures to be constructed in the floodplain if it met certain construction criteria for floodproofing. Now, with some of the changes at the federal level, that no longer is going to be an option to build a residential structure with a basement in the floodplain. So now the option for people, it's basically going to be fill and remove. So fill 2 feet above the base flood elevation and have it contiguous to areas outside the map floodplain. The other, I guess, significant change is going to be the mapping of V zones. V zones stand for high velocity. So in certain instances, there may be situations where if somebody wants to build in a V zone, they're going to be required to build on stilts, similar to what you see in the coastal areas, in the Gulf part of the United States. I guess luckily there's not a whole lot of those areas that I can tell, but there are a few where that could become a very first structure in Brown County that I'm familiar with that are going to be built on stilts. I guess I don't have a whole lot more, but certainly welcome any questions regarding this process. The preliminary mapping is available on the county GIS Brown Dog website for viewing. And if you have difficulty finding that, just please reach out to me and I can put you in contact with where to find it so you can view it for yourself.
That's great, Matt. We can also, if you have it available, we can put it in the chat too for our participants.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was really wonderful. Again, any questions, please put them in chat, or you can message our presenters individually if you want to as well. Okay, so our last presenter for this section is Kira. She is an interdisciplinary community planner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and she will be speaking about an upcoming workshop that we are in collaboration with the Army Corps on. So Kira, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Kayla. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give you a brief overview quickly of the Floodplain Management Services Program for those of you who aren't familiar with it, or FPMS as I'll be referring to it, just so you understand our geographical boundaries. The Chicago District is responsible for water resources development in the Chicago metropolitan area, as well as the Upper Illinois River Watershed, the Lake Michigan Watershed in Wisconsin, and then the Upper Wabash River Watershed in Indiana. So really the objective of the FPMS program is for the Army Corps to provide a range of flood risk information. We provide technical services and some planning guidance to really support and promote effective flood risk and floodplain management. We do require that the studies are flood risk related, so that while there are ample water resource issues throughout the district, this program really is addressing flood risk only. And these studies are just that, they are studies. So we analyze the flood issue, we gather data, we coordinate with other agencies, and we propose some alternatives or ideas to address the flooding. It does not result in construction, so just want to be clear about that, although there are programs both throughout the Corps as well as other agencies and various grant programs that can use the information and the plans developed in the study to implement a project. We usually like to wrap up the studies in about 12 months, but it can extend to 2 years or 24 months if needed. And Just to keep in mind, this is a competitive program. So as we review these request letters, which I'll explain in just a couple of minutes, we'll really be looking at the feasibility of doing the study, the need for it, and the cost. Next slide, please. So right now we're working with the East River Collaborative, as Kayla mentioned, among several other partners. We're working with Brown County, the National Weather Service, the City of Green Bay to implement 3 scopes of work. We're addressing some of the flooding challenges in the East River Watershed, as many of you may be familiar with. We kicked off 3 different scopes in September of 2022. And as part of the technical assistance, we're focused on helping to expand upon the flood preparedness and community outreach efforts that they've already developed. We're exploring some options for flood storage and what options are available to propose for a flood warning system. We do have an upcoming workshop, as Kayla mentioned. It's on January 31st, that we've invited emergency management professionals, as well as some other relevant agencies and organizations in the East River Watershed to really improve cohesion amongst all the different parties, because there's so many working on this different issue, that they work in flood preparation and response efforts. So the goal is not only to just strengthen those relationships, but also share some data and resources that will help inform future efforts to mitigate these flooding challenges. Next slide, please. And so there are 2 routes to apply for FPMS funding. The first is the interagency non-structural proposal application process. Both that you can see here are competitive application processes for the non-structural and the base program. The non-structural does require 2 government partners that will help leverage resources. And typically for both programs, the cost of the technical assistance falls below 100,000 K. The application deadline for the interagency non-structural FPMS program is coming up. That's March 31st. We do have a webinar that we'll be hosting for that in a few weeks to explain a bit more about that. So please reach out to me if you'd like to be added to the contact list for that, and happy to invite you to that. And for the base program, it's a pretty simple application. It really requires just a brief description of the location and the problem. You do have to be a government agency as the primary applicant, and it is 100% federally funded. The deadline is typically in June. The exact date has not yet been set, but we'll circulate information on that, and we will have kind of website pages set up for that, so you can access those as well. And just so you get a sense of the technical assistance we provide through the FPMS program, some sample proposals have included structured damage assessments, dam education and awareness, flood warning and risk communication guidelines, and flood preparedness planning community outreach, like we're doing with ERC, and some hydraulic modeling studies. So if you'd like to learn more and apply for technical assistance through the FPMS program, feel free to email myself or Dave Hanwork. You can see both of our emails there. He is our economic formulation section chief for our planning branch here in the Chicago district, and we'd be happy to talk to you. So I can throw my email address in the chat. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Kayla.
Great, thank you, Kira. Okay, so our next section that we will move right into is the resilience framework. The resilience framework is something we've been working on for a couple years now, with a lot of input from community members. And this is the culmination of this numbers of years of work. So Julia Noordyk will be leading this section. She is the Water Quality and Coastal Community Specialist with the Wisconsin Sea Grant. So Julia, off to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Nice to see a list of participants that are familiar, and then some new folks on the call, which is great. This section is, if you've been with us before, we really do try to integrate a little bit of networking and collaborative building on this forum annually, which is even though it's virtual. So this section is going to be a little bit of information and then a lot of engagement on your part. So I would like, as Kayla mentioned, the East River Watershed Resilience Framework is a culmination really of the last couple of years since we started this project. And it's really to identify high priority and near-term actions, which means like over the next 5 years that folks in the watershed and the communities and partners have really been interested in. So next slide. I presented a little bit on this last year, if you're available, so I'm not going to go into any depth about what is in there. We have an official resilience document that we'll have a link to that's pretty short. So what we did was, when we started the project, we did stakeholder interviews, and we went and talked to individuals around the watershed to just understand what the flood issues were, what their concerns were, and what opportunities they thought there were. So that was the beginning. Next slide. If you remember, we also, from last year, I presented more in depth on this, but we went and also worked with communities in the East River on doing community resilience self-assessments, including identifying like the major flood hazards in their communities specifically, and then also what community impacts there were. So what socioeconomic impacts, community assets, public health, things like that. And so in the finalized framework, you'll actually see the summarization of this information. You know, it's really great to see some of those watershed updates earlier, because a lot of the high priority issues that were identified were nutrients and sediments, park trails, and nutrient loss, and then also, you know, some of the flooding in the buildings and things like that. So it's exciting to see this work move forward, even as we have started this. Okay, next slide. And then the last piece of information that we really gathered was last year at the annual winter forum last January. And if you remember, you all worked on jam boards where we had general themes of issues, and people really put up like what they thought were the most important actions under those themes, what success looked like, what are some of the next steps and resources. So what we did is, for all three of those things, we've been working really hard over the last year to put them together in a concise, what we feel is a pretty concise document that outlines priority action or goals, overarching goals for the watershed based on your input, and then outlines some of those specific actions that we think are like the low-hanging fruit the next 5 years. Next slide. And so what I'm gonna do is just go over some of those really quick. Let's see. There is, if someone could put the link to the document, it's in your your participant packet. And then it's also going to be in a link that you can just look up for. So we're going to really look at those goals and actions right now as a group, and start thinking about how we can move forward. The real goal of what we're going to be doing here is for people to continue to participate and see themselves in the resilience framework. What's really cool as we go through, some of these things have already been started and have made major progress. And we're looking to help support and continue the things that continue to float to the top that the watershed actually really wants to implement. So without further ado, the first goal is investing in a regional partnership. So that's basically the East River Collaborative. Over the last year, we've gotten, our website keeps improving. We have continuous newsletters. We heard a lot of great feedback about our newsletters, and we're going to continue those. But how do we continue past, 2023? Like, people definitely value the investment in this regional effort. And so some of those are some of the near-term actions involved in this. Maybe coming up with a flood resilience implementation plan that goes a little bit farther than just this framework does. And then also just continuing to find funding and bring funding opportunities and build capacity within this region. All right. Next slide, please. The next overarching goal is enhanced recreation opportunities and access to the East River. And while this one maybe doesn't have a lot of near-term actions, they're actually really moving forward quickly. And this is something that every community that we talked to really rallied around. The East River Trail is a major asset for most of our communities, and it really connects everybody and provides that access to the East River and a healthy part of our communities for walking and exercise and things like that. So really important asset. But also what has come up is the East River Water Trail, which Mushinski is going to talk about in a little bit, so I won't go too much into that. Like, how do we get people on the water in the East River and realizing how amazing the East River is? And then thinking about, like, is there some interesting regional things we could do with interpretive signage, like talking about the history of the East River, or some of the major flood events that have happened in general. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the next goal is support restoration and preservation of floodplains, wetlands, and riparian corridors. I think in our word cloud earlier, a lot of people have been in support of this, and there are starting to think about ways we could do this in the watershed more fully. So here's some of those actions include a lot of interest in some of the agricultural practices, like the agriculture runoff treatment systems, or the ARTs. These are big, they're like, we consider them in the East River Collaborative to be nature-based design. They're based off of wetland design, but they're really at the edge of the field, agricultural fields. They have an immense storage capacity of water, but they also are able to, filter out those sediments and improve water quality too. And then also thinking about what Nicole was talking about earlier is, identifying and really focusing on our floodplain areas and reducing stream bank erosion and maybe restoring some of those areas. And then I guess one last action that that keeps coming up is, how do we help the East River Collaborative really help provide that coordination and technical expertise to our communities? Okay, next slide. I wonder if I'm on time here. Probably time. Oh, okay. And address critical infrastructure. This wasn't true for all the communities we work with, but there are definitely some water utilities, some sewerage utilities, and some pump outs and things kind of that nature that have been identified as important, and thinking about where are they vulnerable and maybe what could be thought of as investments. And then also in our rural areas, we heard a lot from our rural communities about drainage ditch backups and then those causing flooding, and thinking about like the flow and the velocity of water really impacting those upstream areas. Okay, next. Strengthen community preparedness. So this has really to do with like how we're, there is a quote by our Brown County Emergency Management Director that says, be more prepared today than you were yesterday. So this is, in that essence, we really want to focus on making sure that if there is a flood emergency in the East River, that our community has those relationships and has the technical expertise and the capacity to help deal with that, so we can minimize the impacts to residents and our community. And so next slide. Encourage and support responsible growth and development. Brown County is one of the top growing counties in Wisconsin. And so what can we do, whether it's regulatory, policy-wise, incentives in our communities to really help keep people out of the floodplain and out of harm's way, and then also not have an adverse impact on those of us downstream too. So these are some of the ideas that have come up over the last couple of years on how to do that. Next slide. And last, but not least, is advanced innovative green infrastructure solutions. We've definitely heard this over the last couple of years come up. We consider green infrastructure and nature-based solutions really at all levels, whether it's rural, suburban, or urban. And we really want to help our communities really drive that forward. So thinking about, and some of our communities have already moved forward on doing some of these actions, which is great. And we want to support other communities in the watershed to do those too. So whether it's policy or implementation, and trying to identify funding, or maybe education and outreach for our residents. Okay, so you have that link available, you have those things in front of you. So what we're gonna do in the next section of this is we are going to take, you're gonna take 10 minutes of individual time to look through this, and then you're gonna participate on the Jamboard again. We have a new Jamboard. So I'm gonna share my screen, but Joy, it says, okay. Okay, can everyone see my Jamboard? And a link should go up to the Jamboard. And so we're going to take 10 minutes. You can take 10 minutes by yourself, look through the actions. There's a lot, so don't get too caught up on, don't think too deeply, or think deeply maybe about one of them. We really want you to participate by putting sticky notes up and seeing where you think your interests are and what these actions, what should we be working on those actions, and you should be working on what you're the most interested in really. So you're going to answer 2 questions. So if you come over here, Jamboard's pretty easy to use. This is a sticky note. So you click on a sticky note and you can pick whatever color you want. So the 2 questions you're going to ask yourself, if there's an action that you really like, is what is the action? So I want to snowshoeing. And then on East River, I don't know if you can snowshoe on the East River or that's dangerous. I have no idea. Sorry if that. And then I'm going to put my initials too, and I'll put Sea Grant, just so we can all know that, that's who's interested. And then, so then you can put that up there if I want, and then I want to think about, okay, well, what my next question really is, what do I bring to this effort? Well, what do I bring? I bring a positive attitude to this effort. I can't spell though. I don't bring spelling. Okay. And then, I didn't put my initials, see? Okay. So pretty simple. And then there's multiple Jamboards. There's a Jamboard for every different goal. As you click through here, they should be in the same order as that sheet and the ones I talked about. And please just populate as you see fit. You can go as fast or slow as you want. If you are having problems participating in the Jamboard, feel free to put it in the chat and we will add it for you. If there's any questions, I'll stop talking now and then we will start the 10 minutes of individual time. And I really hope to see some sticky notes go up there. So. And I will stop sharing.
If there are any questions about this, you can ask out loud or put them in chat as you're going along.
All right. All right, get your last comments up on the Jamboard there. People were definitely, didn't get through everything. It doesn't look as some of the earlier ones are, people are about halfway through the list. That's looking great. Okay, so for this next section, we're going to actually break out into groups of 3 to have small networking discussions. And so your job when you get broken out into a group of 3, and make sure, and we have 10 minutes for this, so please make sure you share your time space and be respectful to everyone in your group. So we're going to introduce ourselves if you don't know each other, and then just talk a little bit about one of the actions and that you were really interested in to share with that group. And then you can continue to add to the Jamboard if you want as we do this. And then afterwards, we'll have a little wrap up. So Joy, our wonderful web technical host, is going to be breaking you up into little breakouts. So you're going to see a button at the bottom and all you have to do is click join. Again, if you have ideas that didn't get up on the Jamboard, so that was difficult, I can put them up there for you. All right, and here we go for another 10 minutes. Thanks for your wonderful participation on this exercise. It looks like there's some really great comments and sticky note stuff put up. So I'll just go through this really quick a little bit, just give you kind of a little virtual tour of what you all have been saying. And we hope you enjoyed that session. So, okay, so invest in a regional partnership, still a lot of folks really interested in keeping the coordination going and even taking it a step further and doing more targeted, potentially implementation and coordination among efforts in general, a more comprehensive plan. And our framework really just does touch just the surface of that kind of stuff. Also a couple comments around actually helping to be more coordinated in our implementation of practices. What action? So enhance, this one is a very popular slide again, and you only had the 3 actions on it, but everyone really wants to get on the water or enjoy the East River, which is really awesome. I think that's so important for all of us, and it is a beautiful place to be. So lots about actually using fishing. We learned that there's like over 30 species of, I'm probably making this up, 30 species of fish in the river currently, which is just kind of amazing. to think about, and it's one of the only undammed rivers in our area, so it's very important ecologically. And then connecting more canoeing and kayaking. So look forward to hearing more about that. Also some comments about doing more education and engaging the public with the water and in general. Let's see, support restoration and preservation of floodplains, wetlands, and riparian coordinator. Like a lot of comments about let's see. Oh, there are actually a diversity of ones on here. So there's implementation sticky notes kind of at the bottom half here of all different types of things, but then also thinking about education and public awareness again, and then even some land acquisition, and then some standards that we could think about. Addressing critical infrastructure. I'm glad these started to get populated at the end. Flood proofing, and a couple comments about identifying specifically critical infrastructure, and then also reducing inflow and infiltration into our stormwater systems and sewage treatment systems. And then also removing invasives that could be actually blocking and causing issues with our critical infrastructure. Strengthen community preparedness. This is where the Jamboards get a little lighter. I think people were making their way through the list, which was pretty interesting to see. But one thing that's a priority is to help develop a flood warning system, because we just need it. Something that can people, we have our emergency responders, and then our residents can be prepared for in case there is a very large emergency situation. And then working with extension and WP, community WP, I'm not sure what that one is. All right. And then support responsible growth and development. And still interested in some of those flood storage ordinance policies and then wetland conservation ordinances. And I know one of our communities, the town of Rockland, had been looking into that actually last summer. So I'll be interested to follow up with them and see and to see how that's coming. And then last but not least, identify funding opportunities and mechanisms, and then combining soft and hard erosion control practices together. I really like this comment, acknowledging that green infrastructure, nature-based solutions are a combination and helping complement and take stress off our gray and traditional infrastructure. And we can't have, one's just not going to be the silver bullet for everything, but it can really help together. We can create better projects in general.
Wonderful. These are all very fantastic. Thanks for going through that, Julia. Okay, so our next round that we're doing are these lightning funder forums. We joked as we were planning that we're going to hear some thunder from the funders, so kind of funny. Just to let you know, this is a very, very packed full section. Funders, please stick within your time minute. We really need to get through these very quickly. So these slides are going to be your cues to go on to the next section. So we're going to start off with Wisconsin Coastal Management. Okay, take it away, Kate and Emily.
Thanks, Kayla. I'm Kate Angel. I'm with the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program. WCMP is located in Madison in the Wisconsin Department of Administration. I'm going to go quick. I'm going to give an overview on our annual grants. You can find more information on those on our website, coastal.wisconsin.gov, and my information and Emily's is there too. WCMP and our grants are funded through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we distribute about $1.5 million per grant cycle. Our grants fund a wide variety of projects. Our project areas include wetland protection and habitat restoration, non-point source pollution control, Great Lakes education, and public access and historic preservation. Eligible applicants include local governments, nonprofits, schools, and state agencies. We do have a non-federal match requirement, and that is a 1-to-1 match requirement for projects with a total cost of up to $60,000 and a 1 to 1.5 for match for projects where the total cost is over $60,000. Our grant periods are for 1 year with a start date of July 1st and an end date of June 30th in the following year. And our next request for proposals will be out in late summer, probably in August, with applications due mid-November and selections made by March. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague now, Emily Rao.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Rao, and I'm currently leading the Wisconsin Coastal's involvement with the next funding opportunity. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is providing funds to NOAA's Office for Coastal Management over the next 5 years to invest in coastal habitat protection and restoration projects to increase coastal communities' resilience to coastal hazards. NOAA has several funding opportunities through this, but one is for the 34 coastal management programs to competitively apply for each year. So the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program is seeking out project proposals to competitively apply for this funding opportunity for this year and into the future. Eligible projects include habitat restoration planning, engineering design, and land acquisition projects that all need to be with a public partner and on public or leased land. The funding range for these projects is between $200,000 to $6 million, depending on the project type. And there's no match, but leverage funding is encouraged. Since we have such a short time today, I'm going to recommend to look at our one-pager that's on our website. It's in the participant package. It can also be linked into the comments. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.
All right, I think I'm up next. Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Eggleston. I am the program officer for the Fund for Lake Michigan. I'll give you a brief overview of what we are and what we fund. We were created out of a settlement over the Oak Creek Power Plant south of Milwaukee. As part of that settlement, they created a fund that would be funded at $4 million a year for 25 years with the very broad mission of improving the water quality of Lake Michigan. So any project that improves water that's flowing into Lake Michigan is a type of project that we would be happy to talk with you about. We do about that $4 million in grant making. Our grants range from $25,000 to about $200,000. Nonprofits, government entities, universities are all eligible for funding. Private entities are not. Applications, we accept pre-proposals on a rolling basis. They can be submitted anytime. And then we make funding decisions 4 times a year at board meetings in March, June, September, and December. Rule of thumb is you want to be thinking about a pre-proposal into us 2 months before a board meeting if you want to get it on one of our dockets. Anywhere in the Lake Michigan basin of Wisconsin is eligible for funding. And all of our applications and information on the types of projects we fund are on our website at fundforlakemichigan.org. We funded a lot of projects you've heard already today up in the Green Bay area: wetland restorations, stream restorations, stream crossings, green infrastructure, planning, design, education outreach, research projects. We help fund the NER designation at UWGB. So we really have a broad range of projects that are eligible, and we love to get first-time applicants applying for grants. So if you have not applied to the Fund for Lake Michigan before and think you have a project for us, please reach out. We'd be happy to talk. We do not have match requirements, but we are a private source of match. So if there are public sources of funding that require match, the fund is usually a very good source to look at for that funding. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Casey. So I am Trina Soik from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm going to touch on a few different funding opportunities that are kind of embedded within our organization, but that's not the only ones that you'll find. But a couple that I want to highlight are the coastal program. It's a voluntary partnership-based program specifically for providing assistance for habitat conservation regarding coastal watersheds. It can be on both public or private land. We offer both technical and financial assistance in this regard. There's different focus areas that include, fish passage, stream channel restoration enhancement, upland restoration, wetland restoration. There's some focal species that are laid out, including monarch butterfly, black tern, dwarf lake iris. Some of those may be associated with your project. You can reach out to Jade Arneson if you want more information about that. I'll highlight our partners program, which is focused more on private landowners, technical assistance and funding opportunities, again, voluntary basis, to restore wildlife habitat on working farms, forests, stream corridors, recreational lands, basically just to foster land stewardship and healthy plant and animal communities. And then I will then highlight the natural resource damage assessment program. So Fox River has a history of PCBs being released, and when there's a nexus of injury to this in the watershed, you can seek funding for restoration projects that restore those injured resources. We are part of a trustee council with the state of Wisconsin, Oneida Nation, Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, and we allocate funding for things like public use projects as they relate to fishing resources, as well as aquatic nearshore riparian restoration, land preservation, and fish population enhancements. So we've already have a history of working with the East River and various funding opportunities for projects with you all. You might hear some from Brown County later on. So reach out if you have any questions about any of those. All of our contact information is included in the packet. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Bree Kopsky, and I'm representing the Office of Great Waters Program at DNR. A major program role for us is to work with partners and stakeholders and serve as a technical resource and then also a coordination resource for planning and implementing actions to restore our Great Lakes and the Mississippi River in Wisconsin. Myself and Stacy Roan are focused in the Green Bay and Lake Michigan watershed basins, and we work with folks to move forward priorities in our area of concern and lake-wide action and management plan programs. You can get more information on those programs if you go to the DNR website and type Great Lakes into the search bar. One of the tasks that we focus on is how to connect federal and state, and then to some degree, local and private funding sources to move forward priority actions. Some of the funding opportunities that we are frequently interfacing with is the Great Lake Restoration Initiative, or GLRI, which has 5 funding priorities across what we call focus areas, and you can see those at the bottom of the screen. We also interface with Sustain Our Great Lakes and NIFWIF, which is focused on restoration and enhancement of fish and wildlife habitat, and I think Stacy is going to be including a link to that funding opportunity in the chat. And then there are some limited state funds through the Great Lakes Protection Fund, which can be used for smaller scale funding needs to move forward Wisconsin's priorities. Next slide. You can see in the image on the left, which shows the amount of GLRI funded projects from the 2010 to 2021 period by congressional district, that GLRI has already allocated over 114 million to support around 230 projects in District 8 alone, and around 415 million to support over 800 projects throughout Wisconsin. So really an infusion of significant resources to improve the Great Lakes. There's a lot of different project types that these funding sources can support. A couple of examples I've included here that we frequently collaborate on with partners through both competitive and non-competitive funding opportunities that may be relevant for the East River watershed. One priority that we have is to implement projects that reduce phosphorus and sediment. We're currently identifying those projects, particularly in the upper East River watershed, among other locations. So if you have project ideas, you can certainly reach out to myself or Stacy Roan, and thanks again for the invite today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Hansen, a regional coordinator for Non-Point Program in the Green Bay office for Wisconsin DNR. 2 grant programs I want to talk about today. We have Urban Non-Point Source and Stormwater Management Grant Program. We have both planning and construction grants for those. These grants are for eligible local units of government, and for urban program, we reimburse the cost of planning or construction projects to control urban non-point source and stormwater runoff pollution. The targeted runoff management grant program is primarily an agricultural focus for controlling non-point runoff from agricultural sources, though there is a component for urban projects to meet TMDL project requirements. Our grant cycle is that we are soliciting applications for projects that will begin in 2024 this year. Applications will go online next week, and the deadline is April of 2023. Potential applicants should contact a regional non-point coordinator early. So if you're in the Northeast area of the state, I would be your contact. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find a lot more information about what we fund online. If you go to dnr.wisconsin.gov and just search non-point grants, you'll find links to both our urban and our TRIM program. DNR is hosting application webinars in February on the 14th in the morning for targeted runoff management grants and in the afternoon for urban grants. So if you want to find more about those, please feel free to contact me and I'll let you know how to connect with those. Thank you.
Okay, our last one, I am subbing in here for Robin Fenig. There are 3 opportunities here through Wisconsin Emergency Management. First is the BRIC funding, which is preventative versus reactive investment in community resilience funding. The flood mitigation assistance is funding that eliminates the risk of repetitive flood damage, so buildings that are insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. And then the last one is the hazard mitigation program, which we're actually working with Wrightstown to apply for. They're to rebuild in a way that mitigates future disaster losses in this community or in communities. So a lot of this HMGP funding is available after a presidentially declared disaster, which in this case would be from the COVID disaster. So that is it for the funder section. Whew, that was a whirlwind. Now we're on to break. Come back in 5 minutes. We'll see you at 10:30. So here we go. Okay. Enjoy some coffee, a bathroom break, or whatever. See you guys soon. So, okay. All right, our next round of presentations are watershed initiatives. We have 3 speakers presenting. They're going to be about projects that are happening in the watershed. You'll be able to hear about some successes and lessons learned and challenges from these presenters. So again, as a reminder, you can put any of your comments or questions in chat. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end where you will be able to ask questions out loud and hear from presenters directly. So let's see, I'm going to start off with our first presenters, Mike Mushinski and Kevin Corbett. They are both from Brown County Land and Water Conservation, and they will be speaking on restoration in the Upper East River Watershed. So Mike and Kevin, glad you could join us.
Thanks, Kayla. Thanks. All right. The water trail, the East River Water Trail and Habitat Project was mentioned a couple of times, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about the Upper East initiative. So this is the Brown County Landfill resource recovery property, town of Holland. So the landfill looks a lot different right now because that's been filled in September of last year. So that landfill is in construction and being filled at this point. So what we looked at here was habitat projects. So habitat, nutrient reduction, and water storage projects on resource recovery property. So the process that we went through, we coordinated with Dean and Chad, our directors at Resource Recovery. We did a series of walks with Wisconsin DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, Nature Conservancy, a lot of interested and helpful groups that coordinated this effort. So we did designs, Dave Wettenkamp did designs. We bid this through Brown County Purchasing, and Apple Valley was selected as our contractor. So again, our collaboration was U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NRDA, Wisconsin DNR, the Nature Conservancy, and Brown County, obviously between Port and Resource Recovery and Land and Water Conservation Department. So our funding sources working through this first phase right now are the Nature Conservancy, NRDA, Fund for Lake Michigan, and Brown County. So there was quite a bit of cropland that was taken out of production to do some of these projects. So there's reduced rental to resource recovery. So there's some loss there. So Kevin's going to touch on more of the details, but So the challenges, one, we're putting this design together for the contractor. So there's some of our normal operations as far as buffers, wetlands, water storage type practices, but we also have woodland management. So for habitat, so coordinating all those was a challenge. There's some non-acceptance for landowners in that area. So because it's a landfill, there's people that aren't real happy with that. So we had some stolen duck nesting houses. We had some damage to equipment from the contractor. So those were challenges. Lessons learned. We will be sending out letters as we continue with phase 1 and future phases to all the neighboring landowners to let them know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how this is all going to come together within a period of time. So just so they know, I think that was the big issue, just not knowing what was happening. So so that's a little background, and Kevin's going to give you some more details. So
yeah, we can do the next slide.
Inventory. So we looked at inventory, that whole area of the Upper East, as far as resource recovery property and into private property. So that was all looked at, all those markings. Next. All right.
Yeah, I'm Kevin Corbett. I'm an engineering tech with the county, and I'll just give a brief overview of some of our project sites. This right here is what we refer to as Site 6. It was Site 6 of 10. We started with just 2 sites, 3 and 6. We split 3 into 3A and 3B, so it's kind of technically 3 different project areas. This one probably had the most diverse amount of things going on with it. Some of the improvements planned here were prairie restoration, woodland habitat improvements, wetland restoration, grass waterway construction, a pike slough creation for northern pike spawning habitat, and also a tree planting of masting trees for wildlife with oak and hickory. So some of the site prep here, this picture on the left doesn't show it really well, but the whole corridor was really thick with willows. So we forestry mowed those willows, followed up with an herbicide spray to control non-native cool season grass and also the resprout of the willow growth. We also took out some larger non-desirable trees such as box elder to kind of make room for our prairie seeding, let some more sunlight in there. Woodland work is still being done. That was where woodland work that was planned is still being done over this winter. There was a lot of dead and dying ash that we aim to remove. We left maybe 10 to 20% of it for wildlife trees, but the rest was taken out and salvaged. The woodland pictured on the right, you can kind of see that woodland block there. Really thick with buckthorn. So we aim to remove all the non-native woody species, buckthorn, honeysuckle. There might have been a little autumn olive in there as well. It's not completely finished. You're kind of seeing the site prep for the prairie seeding, and all that prairie seeding should be done this spring after one more herbicide application to control the undesirable species. In addition, throughout these whole areas, there's going to be clusters of conifers and shrubs planted to kind of increase that diversity. Next slide. Yeah, so this is our site 3A. It was a little more straightforward than site 6. It already had a pretty good buffer, as you can see. This is a tributary of the East River, well buffered. The only issue was it was all non-native species. So our goal was to try to convert it over to a native buffer. The entire buffer was sprayed out to control reed canary. And again, trees were thinned to kind of make room for sunlight for our planned prairie seeding. We also installed 2 wetland scrapes here. You can see that on the picture on the right. That's one of the scrapes on the south end. You can't really see the picture, or you can't see the north scrape, but they're both about a 1/3 acre in size. Kind of the goal to increase flood storage on the East River, also make room for some aquatic habitat and habitat for waterfowl. Besides that, the buffer was widened about 30 feet in total. And again, this is going to be seeded with native warm season grasses and forbs. And there's going to be another mixture of conifer and shrub pockets for diversity. One other thing here, we added a 15-foot corridor. You can see on the, I guess, both pictures, the top kind of woodland. We're trying to make some habitat connectivity between this area and that woodland to the left, to the west, I guess it would be. Just try to improve movement between or for animals between the project areas. And that is going to be one of our future sites going forward. And you can do the next slide. Yeah, finally, this is site 3B. It's kind of a wooded wetland. It drains underneath a road culvert into the project area you just looked at, site 3A. So this was woodland containing mostly ash, maple, and aspen. And as we all know, the ash are dying. And actually a lot of the maple had died too from a couple of years of high water. So we had some clear-cut patches planned to try to get some growth in the understory. But with all the tree mortality, we determined ample light is already getting into the forest floor. It's pretty well vegetated. So we ended up shifting those 3 patch clear cuts into a 1.5 acre aspen clear cut. This is kind of part of our DMAP cooperative with the county. So after consulting with DNR forester, he suggested doing an aspen clear cut rather than the patch clear cuts to try to promote that young aspen forest, which is good for a lot of species, white-tailed deer, woodcock, ruffed grouse, many other birds. So that will be done, the clear cut, and then also the perimeter is going to be planted again with native warm season grasses and forbs, prairie mix. You can't see it, it's the very right picture kind of behind the forest. It's a couple acres of switchgrass is being planted kind of as a bedding area, forage area. And then again, you can kind of see that strip on the bottom middle of the picture. That is another 15-foot wide corridor that connects back to the main stem of the East River to try to promote animal movement between the 2 project areas. So I guess besides that, the only other thing is this whole area is going to be treated again for buckthorn and non-native woody invasive species. And I believe that is all I have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. Our next speaker will be Melissa Schmitz from the City of Green Bay. She is the resiliency coordinator for the City of Green Bay, and will be talking about the code audit that they completed to remove barriers to green infrastructure. So Melissa, take it away. Melissa, you're muted.
Thank you everyone for being here. You can see on the cover slide, I have stormwater in parentheses. So we've pivoted from calling green infrastructure to green stormwater infrastructure, just as a rule of thumb. So if I say GSI or GI, it all refers to the same thing. Next slide, please. So what a green infrastructure code audit is, it's an approach to reviewing and revising and prioritizing municipal codes that prevent the use or have barriers to utilizing green infrastructure in the community. To give you a very brief background, the code audit came out of a result of the 2019 East River flood, but its intention really is to utilize green infrastructure more widely in the community. We realize that green infrastructure, along with traditional gray infrastructure, is necessary for water quality improvement, as well as alleviating some of the localized flooding that Green Bay experiences. So we're really hoping and looking to green infrastructure, utilizing it more for a holistic approach to stormwater management. Some of the benefits of revising and adopting the code recommendations is that it sets the stage for greater use of green infrastructure, but also because this is more of a policy initiative, versus the on the ground projects that you heard about from the last presenter, really long term, it can make a difference in a community with making policy changes in your codes. And it will also increase the resilience long-term for the city of Green Bay to some of the environmental challenges and social and economic challenges that climate change is bringing along. Next slide. The process takes a while. So if your community that is thinking about doing a code audit, just be prepared for that. Of course, it's going to depend on your community and the size community that you're in. But the process started in 2019. There was a grant written from the Great Lakes Commission, and that money was used to hire a consultant to do the code audit, to actually go through all of Green Bay's municipal code, to look for barriers and look for opportunities for text changes within the code. The process also included outreach. Sea Grant, Julia Noordyk from UW Sea Grant gave a presentation to Green Bay's Common Council and also to the Sustainability Commission. So you really need to have education as part of the whole process, especially if the goal is to adopt code changes in the end. Bringing committees and the public along with the process is key. We also had staff workshops with Sea Grant as well, and we followed the methodology that's outlined in a book that I'm just going to grab something real quick. And many of you have probably already seen this, but there's basically a manual called Tackling Barriers to Green Infrastructure, and Sea Grant and NOAA are the primary authors on this, but that was the methodology that City of Green Bay utilized in coordination with Sea Grant. Consultant that we hired started in April of 2020, and the audit itself was completed in October. So about a 5 or 6 month process to go through the municipal code. Part of the other reason why some of this took a little bit longer than normal is the pandemic. So, factor that into staffing, shifted, people are working remotely. So that sort of slowed the process down as well. And then I was hired in October of 2020, and I sort of basically took over the project from where it had dropped off. And I was dedicated in the first several months of my employment to really picking up the project. And then for about 2 years after that, staff, committee, and stakeholder outreach was a big part of it. It was a huge part of the whole length of the process. The actual audit itself was probably the shortest part of the whole code audit project. Next slide. Some of the codes that were examined for barriers included, so there are 4 primary chapters in our code. Chapter 16 and 42 are the chapters that deal with environment and stormwater. Chapter 24 is a part of our code that deals with nuisance, but we have a section in there for planned natural landscapes. That was the first code amendment that we were able to get through and adopted. And then our zoning code, chapter 44, was primarily the landscaping standards within chapter 24, although there were other areas too that were where the recommendations were made. And what it basically looks like is, at least with the consultant that we hired, is after she went through all of our codes, we got a packet of recommendations and a mocked up municipal code, basically with all of the recommendations. And then she provided a grade of all of the codes, whether it was an A, a B, a C, or a D. And that kind of gave us an idea of where we should prioritize the recommendations. So if we received a B rating in one, we knew we weren't going to have a lot of text amendments. But if something received a lower grade, that one would probably take a lot more staff time and public involvement as well. So I provide more background to this in the summary that Kayla sent out yesterday, with a summary of all of the text amendments. Next slide. And what I did to organize myself was I created a Gantt chart at the beginning of when I took over as project manager, and I broke it into 4 phases. So for phase 1, it's really have all of the recommendations in hand. Now you're presenting those recommendations to various staff groups, from your planning and economic development team to parks to public works to the law department. There were many departments that they provided feedback into the recommendations. So the staff input was critical to the entire process. I met with staff into small groups to understand their written comments. I asked for everyone to provide written comments, and then used all of those, next slide, into incorporating staff feedback into the text amendments itself. So I would say it's probably very rare that you just take all of the recommendations from the consultant and start running that through a committee right away. It needs to go through a whole process with staff, with city staff, to be able to gain input and to realize what the concerns and really what the reality of some of these changes might mean. And you have to be patient through the whole process. That's one thing that I learned. And also, some of these things take baby steps. It's not a short endeavor. Also, your law department, the legal reviews took over a year. And that's breaking it up into different sections, and giving the law department a chance to review them and compare them to the existing code. Also, City of Green Bay was going through a whole recodification of their municipal code. So all the numbering was going to change. That was another kind of hurdle that we had to deal with. And it sort of put the project on a little bit of a pause for a while too, because we wanted to get the code recodified before we move forward. And then just work through all of the different committees, whether it's your plan commission for Green Bay, the Improvement and Services Committee, which is mostly public works, the Parks Department. Those were the 3 main, and Sustainability Commission. Those were the 4 main committees that the amendments went through before ever going to Common Council. And then we also did some public outreach as well. We didn't get a lot of public input until almost near the end of the process, and that was with our landscaping standards. And so that sort of, we took a couple steps backward and we addressed some of those concerns. And then in the end, we were able to get the landscaping codes adopted as well, just last month in December. So from start to finish, it was about a 34-month process. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And I definitely encourage, if you go through this process, to reach out to communities that have done it before and to dedicate a person, it's not a full-time person, but dedicate a project manager to the process, because in our experience, we are able to keep the momentum going forward with having a staff person dedicated to the project. I think that's about all the time I have. So if there's any questions, Kayla, do I have any time left over?
We'll have time for questions at the very end.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was really great. Good lessons learned. Our next speaker is Jackson Parr. He is the Flood Resilience Fellow at the Wisconsin Sea Grant, and he will be talking about social vulnerability mapping that he completed in the East River Watershed, or in the Green Bay area for now. Okay, Jackson, thank you so much for joining. Take it away.
Great, thanks, Kayla. And I think with that introduction, we can just kick it to the next slide, get right into it. So my project is looking at flood preparedness in Northeast Wisconsin coastal cities. It's a project that's funded by the National Sea Grant Office. So it's separate from some of the other work that my Sea Grant colleagues are doing in Green Bay / the East River specifically, but there's some kind of parallels and complements there. So my project area is actually 9 cities in the Northeast region. 9 coastal cities specifically, and we're partnered with Wisconsin Emergency Management and the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission on this project. I bolded the phase 1, the flood vulnerability analysis, because that's largely what I'm going to be talking about today, but there are some other phases to the project that'll kick in later if anyone has questions about those. So we can go to the next slide, please. So looking at social vulnerability index mapping specifically, some of you might be familiar with the CDC's social vulnerability index. For our purposes, what we're trying to do is understand where does it flood and who lives there, what are their sociodemographic characteristics, and how then might that information influence preparedness and response procedures. So we really wanted to build on or improve what we had with the CDC social vulnerability index in 2 ways in which we can do that. The first of which is improving the spatial resolution. So you can see on the left, the CDC's version is at the census tract level. And we wanted to get a narrower geography, a higher spatial resolution, the census block group. And that can be important. You see that red arrow that I've used to point at one of the census tracts that kind of straddles both the east and west sides of the East River. And as we know, these physical barriers, things like rivers, can create these discrepancies in things like social vulnerability between them. So we wanted to bring that spatial resolution a little bit higher, going down to the census block group, which lets us see a little bit more of the nuance across, for example, the city of Green Bay. And we also wanted to compare the census block groups that we're interested in to comparable geography. So the CDC's version that you see here, it is a nationwide tool. So it compares the city of Green Bay to, Brooklyn, New York, and West Texas. So by comparing the social vulnerability indicators across like areas, so in this case, about 200 census block groups across the Northeast Wisconsin region, we're able to kind of control for some of those geographic disparities. So if you go to the next slide, one of my kind of best examples showing the importance of increasing the spatial resolution is the city of Algoma. The purple outline you see is a census tract, which essentially covers the entire city. So if we're using census tract data, we're saying, the city of Algoma is kind of a monolith. The values are across the entire city, but going down to the census block group provides us with a little more nuance. It helps us understand kind of where different social vulnerabilities may lie across the city. But increasing that spatial resolution also introduces these higher margins of error. So we're a little bit less certain about kind of the indicator values that we're getting. But we have a few ways of correcting for that as we're creating our index, one of which is using 5-year indicator data. So looking over a longer time scale kind of helps improve the robustness. We can be a little bit more certain that the values we're getting for our indicators are correct. And we've also combined similar indicators. So instead of looking at the percentage of the population that's below 5 years old, we've kind of combined our indicators into, for example, an age population. So those under 15 or those greater than 65. So by combining these indicators, we similarly can help reduce our margins of error. And we also use a method called principal component analysis, which I'm going to get into in another slide or two. So you can go to the next slide, please. So starting out with our social vulnerability index mapping is selecting our indicators. So these are largely taken from the American Community Survey. And we followed both kind of the CDC's social vulnerability index model and more specifically, some other studies that have looked specifically at social vulnerability to flooding events to create this kind of landscape of indicators. We have 19 indicators selected here that we're all going to kind of bake into our final index score. So you can go to the next slide. So the way we do that, the way we create that final index score is through principal component analysis, which is a technique to reduce the dimensionality of a data set while maintaining the maximum amount of information, which is a very jargony way of describing anything. So we're going to talk about it and break it down just a little bit. So if you go to the next part of this slide, we see here kind of 2 indicators from our data set, and you might be familiar with this kind of scatter plot formation. So we have these 2 indicators and we can blast a trend line through it. So we've kind of moved from 2 dimensions down to 1 dimension. But if you click through the next part of this slide, we have 19 indicators, which means we have 19 dimensions. And I personally do not know how to think about 19 dimensions. So we use principal component analysis, which if anyone has any questions about more of the mechanics of that, I'm happy to go into it, but we'll kind of breeze through that in the interest of time. So we're able to take our 19 indicators, our 19 dimensions, create these 7 principal components that really capture almost all of the information in that underlying data set. And then we can weight those principal components in a way that creates a single index score. So going to the next slide, we see on the right here is kind of the first iteration of our social vulnerability index map of the city of Green Bay. And there's a few important things I just wanted to touch on. One of which is we assume here that we've captured everything that contributes to social vulnerability in our indicators, which is impossible to be true. One kind of important fact that the staff at the city of Bay pointed out to me was, using the American Community Survey, which is sent to households, kind of by definition can undercount or leave out a homeless population. So keeping that in mind as we're kind of interpreting this information. And we also still have margins of error present. We were able to kind of get our margins of error down into a reasonable level, a level that's acceptable from kind of the US Census standards, but they are still present. And so if you go to the next slide, our next steps here, we'll be mapping the index score. So here we have kind of our first draft of Green Bay's social vulnerability index map. We'll be doing similar maps for all of the 9 cities in kind of the coastal Northeast Wisconsin region and in the project area. And we're also going to overlay this with flood exposure data. So this is specifically looking at our socio-demographic indicators. But if we overlay things like the floodplain or the percentage of residential properties that are kind of exposed to flooding, we can start to see some of these correlations between, where are the areas that have high flood exposure and also have high levels of social vulnerability. Maybe those are areas in which we need to kind of focus our preparedness, response, recovery resources a little bit more. And all of this will be included in final flood vulnerability analyses reports for each of the 9 project area cities, hoping to wrap those up this spring. And I've also talked with my Sea Grant colleagues about potentially expanding this kind of social vulnerability index mapping to the rest of the East River watershed. So right now, as I said, kind of the project area as it is looking at these 9 cities as kind of single municipalities, but there's opportunities to expand this. So we're looking at the potential of doing that this spring as well. So I think that is it. And Kayla, if I'm right, we'll open it up for questions for the 3 of us.
Yep, that's correct. Thank you so much, Jackson. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so you can either put them in chat or you can ask them aloud. So yeah, what questions do you have?
Oh, I'm going to be so sad if there are no questions.
I don't know if this is bad form, but I actually have a question for Melissa.
Okay.
As a presenter, if that's okay. I was wondering kind of if you can talk about why you adopted the green stormwater infrastructure language as opposed to just.
Yes, that's a good question. So the reason why we changed, or we switched calling it from just green infrastructure to GSI is because actually one of our alders who sits on our sustainability commission said that he had been hearing things in the community of kind of a misperception of what green infrastructure is. And because it's mostly about water quality and how it can improve localized flooding conditions and a whole bunch of other benefits, social benefits, air quality benefits, all these things. But it was actually kind of getting twisted politically. And so people were hearing green infrastructure and thinking it meant a whole different thing. And so we started calling it green stormwater infrastructure so that it was more specific. The term was more specific. And I think that that's been a good move.
Hi, this is Glenn Schwalbuck. I just have kind of a general question. I know in the town of Rockland here on our planning commissions, there's been concern about certain municipalities developing so much land that they are eliminating a lot of wetlands. And I know there's provisions by the DNR that if you do eliminate wetlands, you got to make up for it. But maybe specifically, just because I'm in the town of Rockland, there's a lot of development in Bellevue. And it looks like areas, you know, that were either crops or grassy fields and stuff like that, and kind of low, that are actually, of course, being developed around Costco in that area, south of that area along GV. So is anybody tuned in on just how that gets compensated or minimized, the amount of effect that has? Because we feel that it might be backing up the East River into our town. But I don't know if it's a legitimate concern.
Is this question pointed at anyone in particular? What's your
maybe
favorite?
the Brown County folks that you talked about some of the things they were doing on wetlands.
I actually
Mike,
wonder if that's a question for someone not on this panel. I don't know. I mean, Mike, feel free to chime in, but they're not I don't think their office is the right office.
Yeah, this is Ben Criminal from the village of Bellevue. Not necessarily the right time to go down this discussion, but Glenn, I'm happy to connect with you about how the village does support, strong, careful, thought out growth, including, ensuring that any development has proper stormwater containment as well as treatment factor to make sure that everything is accounted for. So I'm happy to connect with you outside of this team if you'd like to in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great, because personally, I'm thinking that maybe they're getting criticized unfairly.
Yep. Happy to help in any way we can to help answer any of those questions.
And this is who's speaking?
This is Ben Kremenauer, the administrator for the Village of Bellevue.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You got it.
Great question. We have one question in chat. Well, actually, we are just at time. But we can definitely get to that question, Nicole, that you have in chat for Brown County. If there are any lessons learned working with the DNR. Oh, and it looks like Matt Geezy has a question for the group too. But we're going to keep going, and we'll answer some of these questions later on and make sure that everyone gets them. So thank you all presenters, Jackson, Melissa, Mike, and Kevin. We are going to move on to our next presenter, Larry Weber, who just put a link into chat here. Let's see, I have a little intro for Larry here. So Larry is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Iowa and the co-founder of the Iowa Flood Center. Since the Flood Center's start in 2009, he has been active in conducting statewide floodplain mapping and watershed projects for flood damage reduction. This includes a project funded by a disaster resilience grant from Housing and Urban Development called the Iowa Watershed Approach, which he'll be talking about. It's a project to reduce flooding, increase water quality, and improve resilience and engage stakeholders. So additionally, as a member of the Water Resources Coordinating Council, he has participated on numerous state and federal agency committees related to water resources planning. And on a personal note, he is a native Iowan and enjoys outdoor activities, including fishing, hunting, woodland restoration, and conservation work. So Larry, thank you for sharing your slides. Take it away. I will, when we have 2 minutes left, I'll give you a little sign, 2 minutes left. And then we'll get into some questions for you too.
Okay,
so thanks.
Sounds good, Kayla. Can you hear me okay?
You're great.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks to everybody for inviting me to join your program today. I just wanted to provide a little update. I'm Larry Weber, professor at Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Iowa and director of the IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering program. which is a hydraulics, fluid mechanics, water resources, and environmental engineering and sciences program here at the university that began in 1920. So we celebrated our century anniversary in the first year of the pandemic. So we do work that ranges from watershed hydrology to ship hydrodynamics and river mechanics and so on and so forth. This is our iconic C. Maxwell Stanley, home of the hydraulics program here at the University of Iowa. And this photo was taken on June 16th of 2008, just as the Iowa River was cresting outside of the lab in a 100-year-old facility. This is a 500-year or higher event. So very interesting time for us in 2008. As you might recall, Cedar Rapids was sort of the iconic community that was flooded in 2008 with the Cedar River having risen to flood stage. 30,000 people were evacuated from their homes overnight. The river had risen up to within about a foot of overtopping the levees that protect the community, around 8 times throughout the history of those levees. In 2008, it overtopped the levees by about 10.5 feet. Flooded 1,300 city blocks of the community, roughly a $10 billion loss across the state of Iowa. From that loss, the Iowa legislature approached me and a few colleagues at the hydraulics lab and asked us for some input as the legislature was beginning to make decisions for the recovery of the 2008 floods. So we came down and presented to the Iowa legislature on a few occasions during the legislative session of 2009. That led to the creation of the Iowa Flood Center as the nation's only academic research center focused on flood science. We have a number of very specific programs that help to serve the state of Iowa. One is on flood monitoring. The image here is of one of our bridge sensors, or water level sensors attached to bridges. It's an ultrasonic level indicator that measures the distance to the water surface, has a small solar panel, an internal battery and a battery charge regulator, a GPS antenna to communicate data of water level back to the flood center every 15 minutes. We currently have about 350 of those deployed across the state of Iowa, indicated here with the blue symbols. The green symbols are the USGS streamflow network in Iowa. And again, we always recognize the USGS is the absolute gold standard of stream level monitoring that provide the most vital information to our state. Our sensor network is oftentimes on smaller ungauged streams upstream from small communities, as well as filling in gaps of monitoring information to augment the USGS streamflow network. We also have our own rainfall products. This is just an image. We have 5 NexRad radar that overlook the state of Iowa. This is a composite of the imagery from those 5 radar as projected as rainfall intensity of a storm that was passing through northwest Iowa, or excuse me, northeast Iowa. We also do some statewide hydrologic monitoring. This is a monitoring network that we're building. We're intending to have one in each of the 99 counties in Iowa, plus 1 extra. So we'll have a full 100 sensor network across the state. You can see in the image here, we have a dual impact astrometers that measure rainfall intensity. One of them has wind speed and direction on it as well. Again, a small solar panel for charging a battery. And then we have soil moisture and soil depth. Soil moisture and soil temperature monitored at 2 inches, 4 inches, 8 inches, and 20 inches of depth. And then a shallow well to measure the distance down to shallow groundwater. And of course, this hydrologic monitoring network is providing vital information to us with respect to antecedent soil moisture conditions prior to flooding, as well as conditions related to drought, which we've experienced extended drought conditions over the last couple of years. We'll also work on a flood forecasting, stream flow forecasting model. We have the state of Iowa delineated into 800,000 hill slope stream segment pairs, and therefore have a forecast every 15 minutes at 800,000 locations in Iowa. That's too many for the public to consume. And so we've distilled that down to about 1,000 critical points along rivers and streams in Iowa. Roadway crossings, communities, critical infrastructure, basically providing a stream flow forecast at 1,000 locations. And we provide that in a way that is somewhat cartoonish here, but you can see a location where we're providing a forecast. We also provide a no rain scenario, a 2-inch rain scenario, and a rainfall forecast as forecasted by the National Weather Service. And we make that forecasted elevation relevant to that site and the standardized flood response levels of action level, flood level, moderate flood, and major flood. We've also been involved in floodplain mapping and created the floodplain maps that are statewide, as well as for roughly 30 communities in the state. And here's just an image from Cedar Rapids, where we now project the flood levels based on a local USGS gauge. We get the flood extents, and the user can click anywhere within the inundated area and know the flood depth at that location, as well as providing damage estimates for buildings and contents. Even though we have this wonderful information, beginning in 2009, we still have disasters in Iowa related to floods. And just over the last 30 years, we've had over 1,000 county level presidential disaster declarations with total losses exceeding $20 billion. And from that continued need, we were involved in the National Disaster Resilience Competition. This was an Obama administration program that brought about $500 million of clawed back resources from Housing and Urban Development, as well as $500 million from the Rockefeller Foundation into the National Disaster Resilience Competition. I led the proposal development for the state of Iowa that resulted in a grant of $96.9 million that balanced urban watershed resilience along with community flood damage reduction and resilience. And we spent roughly about $40 million in 8 rural watersheds and another $40 million in the cities of Dubuque, Coralville, and Storm Lake, along with about $15 million of technological and engineering support into the program. In Iowa, we've been developing watershed management authorities as the local governing structure to be able to facilitate the engagement of landowners, the development of watershed plans, of flood resilience action plans, and of siting of green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, conservation practices, predominantly on private lands for the goal of flood damage reduction and water quality improvement. Today, this map is just a year out of date. We're now over 30 watershed management authorities in the state of Iowa, and I would hope that eventually we would have the entire state participating in a watershed management authority of their local watersheds. Our approach in the Iowa Watershed Approach Project is to begin with a hydrologic assessment, work with the local community, the watershed community, in developing a watershed plan. We have flood resilience action plans, which there's a really nice guidance document on the link that I shared in the chat that Jackson and others might be interested in terms of flood resilience action. We then fold those into the local, county, and community level hazard mitigation plans and disaster recovery plans that are important for eligibility for state and federal disaster recovery funds. Our program following the planning activity then has led to the identification and mapping of all conservation practices in the state of Iowa. This has now been completed for the entire state, where you can see to the right here, based on LiDAR imagery, you can identify a small farm pond. The image just to the left shows terraces on more steeply sloped landforms in western Iowa. And so across the entire state, identified within a Huck 12 and then summed up to the Huck 8 scale, we know where every farm pond, every wetland, every terrace, every grassed waterway is. And so that was an important baseline for us to understand where we might implement practices. And then we've used the agricultural conservation planning framework which is a tool that's based on LiDAR information, soils information, land use, land cover information, and slope information to help identify locations that would be suitable for grassed waterways or farm ponds or wetlands or bioreactors and saturated buffers. And we've intersected that ACPF data along with the BMP mapping data to, one, calibrate the ACPF tool to ensure that it's working well, and then two, to guide the watershed coordinators whose job it is to go out and engage landowners on the potential adoption of practices within the program. We've done some fairly unique practices. This is up in Northeast Iowa, working with folks in the Turkey River Watershed and the Upper Iowa Watershed. They've adopted by county ordinance, an ordinance that allows when a roadway gets damaged or destroyed, or the culvert that goes through that roadway or under the roadway gets damaged or destroyed during a flood event, that the county can consider, rather than replacing that structure as it was before the event, to replace that structure with an on-road structure that provides a very small lower level outlet combined with an upper level discharge point that inundates water or backs water up, most commonly again on private lands. So there is a landowner easement agreement that is associated with each one of these projects, but uses the roadway as the embankment to have a distributed storage of slowing water down during heavy and intense rainfall. We've also built a number of larger wetlands. This is a wetland of roughly 8.5 acre pool area draining about 100 acres of agricultural land. It's a multi-celled wetland that allows water to come in here to the left or the upstream side, flow through a number of sediment traps and controls into the primary cells of the wetland, and then discharged off to the right as flows go downstream. So one, providing attenuation of stream flows during heavy rainfall, but also then providing water quality improvement year round. So practice that was adopted throughout our program. We provided in the project a 90-10 cost share, which we began the program suggesting a 75-25 cost share. As we got started in our work in 2015 and 2016, commodity prices were soft across the agricultural Midwest. And so we went back to HUD before we built the first project and asked that our cost share raise to 90-10. And as expected in doing so, we had landowners signing up throughout the 8 watersheds that we were working in, quite interested in building our projects. In fact, of course, by the end of the program, had more interest than funding available. We've done very detailed assessment to understand the benefit of these practices, both in applying practices throughout the watershed in an initial hydrologic assessment, addressing climate change, recognizing that we will see a roughly 20% increase in the 5% rainiest days in our watershed by late century. So a 5-inch rain is going to become a 6-inch rain is a simple way of thinking about that by 2100. And then looking at these ponds and built structures as compared to cover crop and no-till or a soil health program, as well as 100% native vegetation. So we've done that work. We have some very detailed studies here in the Middle Cedar, where looking at the practices that were built here, ranging from buffer strips and grade stabilization to larger wetland projects. You see them clustered at the Huck 12 scale, where we were trying to make a more significant impact. The Middle Cedar has 68 Huck 12s. 11 of them were selected for project construction, 28 ponds, 10 wetlands, and other associated practices that went into that program. And at the local scale, we see about a 50% reduction in stream flow at the pond or the wetland. But unfortunately, at the larger scale for the Cedar River, the total of about 1,200 acre feet that we're storing is small relative to the major events of 2016 and 2008, where we had roughly 1 million and 2 million acre feet of flow into Cedar Rapids. And so we're making a projection that to get a 10% reduction in the Cedar River at Cedar Rapids, rather than 84 projects, we would need about 17,000 projects. with 640,000 acre feet of storage at a cost of roughly $2 billion. And to put that into terms, across all of the major flood events, top 10 flood events over the last 20 years, to get a 20% reduction, we're looking at about $4 billion of green infrastructure within the Cedar River watershed. So with that, I'll just close with one of my favorite quotes from Theodore Roosevelt: "Far and away the best prize that life has to offer is the chance to work hard at work worth doing." And we think that this watershed scale work is very much worth doing. So hopefully I've left a minute or two for questions, and I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you so much. That was jam-packed of really incredible information. We have a bunch of questions in the chat. So I guess let's start with the top one here from Melissa Schmitz. Do the flood center gauges communicate with the USGS gauge network? And does the flood center utilize any funding from FEMA?
Yeah, so we have combined all of the USGS and IFC data together in our one kind of stop shop for information, and that's shared, throughout the state and with our federal partners. We do also have a direct data sharing agreement with the National Weather Service, who uses our information to help inform their forecasts. So we work very closely with the river forecast centers, as well as the Water Science Center at USGS. So again, our strong statement is that we are not here to replace the backbone information systems and forecast models of the federal government, just here to help and to augment them and have a great working relationship with all our federal partners.
Wonderful, thank you. And she also wants to know, is the soil moisture data shared with the agricultural community?
Yeah, interestingly, our goal to build out that soil moisture network was proposed to the Iowa legislature and made it into an appropriations bill that the governor vetoed for other reasons, because it included K-12 funding. That was several years ago. With the IWA project, we did install 22 of those sensors. And so we have 22 of the 100 built. And then we recently, in the last year, worked with our two local congressional representatives, Representative Hinson and Miller Meeks, and requested through the Community Project Funding Program at the federal government, funding to build a hydrologic monitoring network sensor in each of the counties in congressional districts 1 and 2. So we'll be adding about 40 sensors to the 20 that we already have out. And that soil moisture information is then folded into a drought information system. And yes, of course, very helpful to agricultural producers that need better drought severity maps to qualify for drought assistance programs. So that's how we're compositing it. But every one of our sensors is available publicly and online. So we have local farmers that are using that soil temperature, soil moisture network also just for, cropping decisions and planting decisions and other things. So.
Great. Okay, so I'll skip my question. So I'll go to others who have questions. Christopher Sampson has asked, Iowa has made a huge financial investment, obviously. Can you hazard a guess as to how much lawmaker citizen support can be attributed to preserving precious farm soil is one of them, more environmentally aware generally, and also protecting downstream cities? What moved the needle most?
So one of the things I would say, so the Iowa legislature has supported the Iowa Flood Center at roughly about $1.25 million a year for the 10 or 12 years that we've been in existence. And from that, $1.25 million a year, so call it about, $12.5 million over 10 years, we've drawn down about $140 million of federal support into the state of Iowa through our grant writing activities, the biggest being the $96.9 million in the IWA program. So the return on investment, if you will, has been significant. So that's been good. The thing that I've been most proud of, though, is how we've raised the literacy around watershed issues in the state of Iowa through the Iowa Watershed Approach Project, working with watershed management authorities, working at that very local community, watershed community or traditional community level, working with citizens on understanding flood risk, understanding watershed processes, understanding water quality related issues. I remember early on in some work we were doing up in Northeast Iowa in the Turkey River watershed, and one of the Watershed Management Authority chairs said, you know, look, Weber, you can come up here and talk about flooding all you want, but as soon as you talk about water quality, you know, they're going to run you out of town. And that watershed now hosts the largest density of water quality monitoring nitrate sensors anywhere in the country. And those landowners have adopted that network. They're curious of how their watershed compares with other neighboring watersheds. And I think that we've taken some of the fear out of scientific data and the use of that data to improve our decision making. It's not perfect by any means, but we've certainly increased the watershed literacy across the state.
Amazing. Okay, we have one last question here. Have you quantified the increase in hydrologic loading due to the reduction of organic matter in the soils and the installation of drain tile on ag fields? And have you offered any programs to reduce drain tile or increase organic matter?
Well, I will just say first that because Kayla restricted me to such a short time and I talked super fast,
Great.
I stripped out all of the water quality and tile drainage impacts and things of that nature. And so I'd be delighted to come back and speak to you again if you have an interest in understanding things. We have done some very specific and detailed studies on the impact of tile drainage, on the impact of agricultural and livestock manure on agricultural lands. And, you know, the sadder part of our story is that under the period of time in which we're supposed to be striving towards a goal of 45% nutrient reduction from the state of Iowa, our loads have doubled and they're continuing to increase. And we have very specific data that describes why that's happening, how that's happening, and proposes some solutions towards that, which is going to be more than more money and more cost share. We will not cost share our way out of the water quality crisis in Iowa. It will require legislative and policy changes. And so again, happy to share more and more specifics, perhaps in next year's meeting or some other time.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back. Okay, so then Melissa has a really quick question here. Are the hydraulic studies on the Iowa Flood Center website?
Yeah, so we are just closing out IWA right now. And so we're writing our final reports for each of the 8 watersheds that we're working in. They're out in draft form for review to our watershed partners. They'll be posted sometime in the next month or so as they're completed. The original hydrologic assessments are all available today. And so if you go to that link, if you can't find them, Melissa or anybody, certainly don't hesitate to shoot me an email, or Kate Giannini, who's identified on the website, for more information, and one of the two of us will get back to you.
Okay, great. Well, I know we're at time here. So we have all of our speaker contact information in your participant packet. And you're welcome to reach out to them, shoot them an email. So that's it. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We really are very appreciative of your participation and engagement, especially in the resilience framework. And there will be a link in the chat for our post-event survey. So please fill that out. I'll also send you an email later just as a reminder. So thank you again so much. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Kayla.
Thanks.